Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Geyn. Today we're looking into what happens if jokes go too far. Is it within the power of the government to censor a rude or offensive joke? This question was recently heard by the Supreme Court of Canada in the case of Ward and the Quebec Human Rights Commission. Between 2010 and 2013, the famous Quebec comedian Mike Ward told a series of jokes about a young disabled boy in Quebec named Jeremy Gabriel. Young Mr. Gabriel had become somewhat famous himself for singing and for the story of his challenges with disability. He has Treacher-Collins syndrome, which causes facial abnormalities and requires him to use a bone-implanted hearing aid. Ward's jokes were undoubtedly cruel, and there was no question that they harmed young Mr. Gabriel, who was relentlessly bullied at school to the point where he became suicidal. Mr. Gabriel and his mother complained to the Quebec Human Rights Commission, and in 2016, Mr. Ward was fined $37,000 for violating the dignity of Mr. Gabriel. The Supreme Court is now considering whether the Quebec government can impose fines like this for jokes that go too far, or whether this is an unjustified limit on freedom of expression. My charity, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, participated in that case as a friend of the court and asked the court to adopt a wide view of the right to freedom of expression. Today, we'll be examining this debate. First, we're going to speak to comedian Michael Lifshitz, and then we'll be joined by our panel of legal experts. Mr. Lifshitz, thank you so much for joining me today. Now,
Thank you for having me.
You're a comedian, and you're also a person who lives with a disability. Can you tell me, from your perspective, should there be limits on jokes like this that go too far?
I don't think the courts are where or the government is where the limits should be. I think it should be left to public opinion. So I'm not of the school of thought that there should be no consequences. People can say whatever they want. I always like to say freedom of expression doesn't mean freedom from consequence. But what I mean by consequences is, in my mind, it's up to the public to decide, is a joke too far? Which means if I were to say a joke and people are offended, people want to say what they want about me on social media, they want to petition that club shouldn't book me, that's their prerogative. And I have to live with that as a result of the joke I told. But I don't believe it should be for the government to say that joke went too far and we're going to fine you.
Now, if this was the case, that you knew that you could get a fine from the government and not just be penalized by, audience reception to jokes, if you knew it was the government that could impose a fine in tens of thousands of dollars, how would that affect you as a comedian?
I think I'd certainly be more cautious, obviously. Yeah, I mean, if we're going to get a fine for $10,000, I don't know if any joke is worth $10,000, to be honest. Personally, so in fairness, every comic has a different style. I tend, I have a compulsive need to be loved, so I tend not to be that edgy. So I don't know if it would restrict me that much. But yeah, I think it would be in back of our mind uh, that we could be fined for speaking out, right? So if a comic's role is to critique society, or what if we tell a joke about a politician? Are we going to be fined? Like, where is that line of what is in good taste, what's in bad taste, right? Who decides that?
And as a person who lives with a disability, what that was kind of what these jokes were about. They were about disability, and how do you view that as a part of that community? How do you view those jokes as part of that community as well?
So I'm going to preface my comments because I find people tend to say black and white. I 100% sympathize with Mr. Gabriel,
Absolutely.
and absolutely he should not be bullied. But to me, it's interesting. So in the case, the courts, I believe, ruled that he wasn't being, Mr. Gabriel wasn't being treated equally. If Mr. Ward is known for doing jokes that are edgy and making fun of different groups, in reality, he's actually being equal to Mr. Gabriel by treating him like everybody else. So I find it funny that we're talking about the joke when some of the reaction is more discriminatory. For example, one article I saw referred, oh, we should not be making
Michael.
jokes about the sick or infirmed.
Yeah, I mean, it's really troubling. I thank you so much for
Okay.
your perspective and for joining us today to talk about this.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Geyn, and we're discussing what happens if a joke goes too far and the power of government to limit comedy. Joined by me now is our legal panel. First, Mr. Julius Gray, who represented Mike Ward, the comedian, at the Supreme Court, and Joanna Barron of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, who intervened in that case, and by lawyer Marie-Hélène Beaudoin. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Mr. Gray, I'll start with you. Can you explain to me why Mr. Ward shouldn't need to face a penalty when, the sort of undisputed fact is that he did hurt this boy?
First of all, it's not an undisputed fact. Even the first instance court said that the mocking in the schoolyard was not necessarily all caused by this. Secondly, no one disputes the possibility of a private law remedy. You can sue somebody if he's harmed you. But the idea of the state coming in and saying you cannot say this or it's discriminatory is dangerous. It's dangerous because it seriously limits freedom of expression. It makes it impossible to say anything good, because if you can't say something bad about somebody, then anything you say which is good, it doesn't count either. It all becomes very plastic and very repressed. In order to have freedom in our society, the state, except in the most clear and obvious cases like official secrets, should not prohibit people from speaking.
Now, Ms. Beaudoin, let me turn to you. Can you tell me, isn't this sort of a form of government censorship if the government can impose a penalty for jokes?
Well, first of all, I would like to just say, for me, it's not really the government imposing a penalty. What happened here is actually a remedy that's been given in order to protect the dignity right. So the person exercised their right in front of a specialized tribunal. And so it's not a fine. It's not like somebody confiscated somebody's assets or anything. It's not a penal law. And the damages that were imposed are actually moral damages. And their goal is to repair the harm that was done.
So it's not actually... This money was paid to Mr. Gabriel and his mother, not to, the state, correct?
Exactly. So in this case, it's like government assisting somebody in making their right be protected. But it's not actually, for me, the government censoring anything. Otherwise, it would just be saying every time there's a case in court, it's the government coming into your contract and actually telling you what's wrong or what's right. So here, I'm a bit worried about the terminology, saying that it's the government censoring and imposing fines. I'm not really in agreement with that.
So Ms. Barron, let me turn to you. Is this government action? Is this the government imposing a penalty? And if it's not a fine and it's damages, why wasn't it just a private law remedy for Mr. Gabriel?
Yeah, I think the distinction between human rights tribunals and the government that Ms. Beaudoin has made is too fine and too cute by half. At the end of the day, it's a human rights tribunal that is imposing the fine, that is assessing the level of harm done, that is saying that this speech crossed the line and violated a public notion of dignity. It's clearly not a matter between private individuals. And so I do think that this law is expanding the state's right, the state's reach into free speech and into comedy more particularly.
Mr. Gray, do you want to respond to any of that?
Yes, I think it certainly is a public law matter. The effect is a public law effect as well. Anybody who becomes a comedian will know that there are limits to what he can say. And you can imagine that in many, many societies, comedy was the one way of making fun of it. And what Mr. Ward wanted to do was puncture the balloons of so-called sacred cows in society. People who are never attacked, people who are... Political correctness says you have to be nice to them. Well, an attack on political correctness in today's world is obviously something that should be tolerated and, in fact, is a good thing.
Yeah. So what about the question of offensiveness alone? I mean, the issue here was that the speech was offensive speech that Mr. Gabriel felt like it damaged his dignity. I want you guys to just think about that for a minute. Is offensiveness alone enough to limit speech? We're going to address this topic when we come back from this commercial break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about free speech and comedy. Joanna, I want to follow up on that last question for you. Is offensiveness alone enough to limit speech, or does it need to rise to some higher threshold?
So the constitutional limits of speech in Canada are hate speech, which is speech that clearly poses a danger to a protected group, and nobody is arguing that this is hate speech. Otherwise, there are remedies in private law like defamation or even online harassment. But it's important to note that comedy, protected speech, our freedom of speech has to show up in statements that are inherently offensive or even repugnant. Hallmark cards don't usually bring up the nature of the constitutional law.
Marie-Hélène, can you respond to that? Is this just about limiting speech we don't like and speech that's offensive, or is there something else going on here?
Sure. Well, the debate is really framed around freedom of expression, but to begin with, it's an issue of dignity. So it's like every court has put aside the issue of offensiveness. If you ask any of the jurists that have been asked to pronounce themselves on this issue, they will always say, well, we don't like this joke. It's not, to us, it's not funny, but that doesn't matter. It's offensive, that doesn't matter. That's not the criteria. We're trying to see whether there are legal principles that warrant here that there would be a limit on freedom of expression. And I think everybody would have to agree that there are limits. There have to be limits somewhere, but obviously people don't agree on what the limits are. But we can't say that there are no limits.
And in this case, it's sort of specific to Quebec because the concept of dignity is unique to the Quebec Charter. It's a sort of uniquely French concept. Could you just explain that briefly for our viewers who might not be familiar with that as an idea?
Yeah, sure. So, well, basically, like dignity is it's inside every basic right that we have. It's usually implicit to that right. In the Quebec Charter, they've decided to make it explicit. So it's explicitly mentioned that every person has a right to be protected in their dignity. So just as reputation, we know about that defamation law. People know that they have a right to be protected in their reputation, but in Quebec, it's the dignity. So that's just making sure that everybody can be treated equally and would not be seen as inferior or less dignified as a human being. So that's the right to dignity.
So, Mr. Gray, if this is about dignity, this concept that's really only explicit in the Quebec Charter, is there a concern that you have that this law, you know, if the Supreme Court rules on this, that this speech can be limited this way, could this apply outside of Quebec, or is the result of this case going to be limited to Quebec?
Of course, it can apply outside Quebec. I think it's completely untrue that dignity is more protected in Quebec than anywhere else. It's protected in a particular instrument. And I must point out to you that it's not offensiveness that's the issue. It's discrimination, they say. It's a tribunal that deals with discrimination. So it's only on the basis of those prohibited things like sex, gender, race, etc., handicap. You can be offensive. And this particular provision will not apply. What it is really is an ideological imposition of the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms. If you disagree with the ideology of non-discrimination, if you have a different version of it, if you think it shouldn't apply to this or to that, then it becomes offensive. But you can still be offensive to people. So it's not the offensiveness that matters here. It's the imposition of an ideology.
Now, one of the things that's been concerning about this case is the chilling effect. Will comedians stop telling jokes if there's a chance that they could face financial penalties for these jokes? Joanna, we've got about a minute in this segment. What's your view on the consequence on comedians of chilling effect?
I think comedy by its very nature involves hyperbole, exaggeration, satire, black comedy. And so I think absolutely if fines like this are permitted, it means that there's danger in coming close to the line. And so like our colleague, Mr. Lifshitz mentioned, there will undoubtedly, if this type of state intrusion is permitted to continue, of course, no comedian can routinely accept a $42,000 fine for doing their shtick. So I think it's very concerning. And comedy has a very powerful role in societies from ancient times.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been used historically to sort of target the powerful, and it says a lot about society. We're going to get back into this after our commercial break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice. Let's jump right back into it on our conversation about comedy and censorship. Ms. Beaudoin, when we read these jokes, they don't seem funny when you read the transcript, but I think a transcript of a joke read out in court is almost never going to be funny. The reality in this case, though, is that the audience laughed at the jokes. So does that matter? Is there any obligation? Does it matter that the audience laughed?
Doesn't really matter. The law doesn't distinguish what's funny, what's not funny. Like, courts aren't there to arbiter what's good taste and what's not. If you gather a crowd of people and have hate speech and they cheer for you, does it make it legal? If you publicize a video where you're dismembering people and some people like to watch that, does it make it legal? It's not the public's reaction in that room. What the charters go by is society in general. So, I mean, I will not be pronouncing myself on Mike Ward's humor. He's a very professional comedian. He's done very well. He's got his public laughs at these things. But should we be basing what the charter protects as rights on what Mike Ward's public finds funny? I don't think that's how the law goes. So.
Now, Mr. Gray, these jokes were told, 10 years ago. Is there a concern here that we're judging Mr. Ward for jokes told 10 years ago by a different standard in 2021?
Well, if so, then the standard of 2021, the standard of wokeness is the wrong one. But 10 years ago, clearly people laughed. And people thought those things. The sacred cows of Quebec society, many people thought that. Not everybody was brave enough. The nature of comedy, if it is to succeed, is it must be near the margin. People must gasp when the person, will he dare or won't he dare? And then he does it. And if you create a society of conformists who are always very moderate and just do plays on words and little innocent jokes, then you will lose a major instrument of social criticism.
Ms. Barron,
if I can just jump in on that
absolutely.
issue, if you don't mind, Christine. Here, the issue was really just that one identifiable person was chosen and was spoken about for 2 years. So it's not saying that you can't make any dark humor or any dark comedy or edgy comedy. It's just like when you're taking somebody as your target, then there might be consequences, and you can have this speech. You can use your freedom of speech, but there might be consequences if you hurt somebody by doing that. That's the issue.
Some people have said that it's more dangerous to go generally than for one person. For instance, jokes about imitating gay people or imitating accents and so on. There have been Supreme Court judgments which have said it's more serious to attack the group than the person. But I think both are permitted as short of hate. Short of hate, which the Supreme Court defined as the most extreme, as inciting to pretty well killing. I think it's important that there be freedom to laugh, even if some people gasp.
Joanna, we've got about 20 seconds. I'm going to give you the final word on this. What's your response?
Yeah, I don't think that the examples Ms. Baudouin brought up of group rallies or hate speech are comparable, because there you're talking about objective proof of harm, and speech, unless you can connect it to some incitement or to hate speech where there's tangible proof of harm, the state should have no role in restricting expression.
That's all the time we have. Thank you all so much for joining me. Great perspective. We've heard today about the debate about what to do when jokes go too far, and whether the government can step in and stop people from telling offensive jokes. At some point or another, everyone has laughed at a dark joke. Dark humor is a style of comedy that pushes the envelope. It finds the barriers in society and can often leave the audience laughing while simultaneously wondering if they should have laughed or not. In my view, in a free and democratic society, recourse for offensive jokes does not lay with the government. If a joke is truly extreme and damaging, there may be private law remedies, like a claim of defamation or perhaps the newly created tort of online harassment. But allowing the Quebec government to set the limits on comedy through fines creates a chilling effect for other performers in the province, and it's an undue limit on the right to freedom of expression. Speech, even controversial or repugnant speech, is protected from unjustified state intrusion. And even if Mr. Ward's comedy routine was distasteful, it shouldn't be policed by the government. Like all comedy, it should be policed by audiences. But what do you think? Thanks for tuning in, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.